Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining our launch of the National Food Waste Strategy Feasibility Study. My name is Carolyn Cameron. I'm the General Manager of Food Sustainability for the Food and Agricultural Growth Center, known also as FIAL, and I'm your host for today. I'm really looking forward to our conversations. As we commence, I acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Ngunnawal people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and the waters of our nation. Because people are all over the place, and so it's really important that we continue our procedures to recognize and acknowledge the traditional custodians of our lands, no matter where we are. I have a couple of formal apologies for today from Michelle Allen, who's FIAL's chair, and from John Webster, who's the chair of the Fight Food Waste Limited. So we have a number of speakers today to launch the study and talk about the study and respond to the study. So we're going to kick off with Dr. Mirjana Prica, who's the Managing Director of FIAL, to provide an official welcome, and then we'll continue with the procedures. Thanks, everyone. On to Mirjana, please.
Thank you, Carolyn, and good afternoon, everyone, and greetings from a very warm Sydney. Hope you're all safe and well wherever you are and enjoying your day. I'd like to just welcome everyone, and I'm really delighted to see some familiar faces as well as some new faces to join us today to launch this very important feasibility study. Especially, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Assistant Minister Trevor Evans. Thank you for joining us today, and we're really delighted that you can see the launch of the significant study that's been undertaken. As Carolyn's already said, some of you may already know who we are as an organisation, but FIAL is an industry-led not-for-profit organisation that was established by the Commonwealth in 2013 to drive the productivity and the competitiveness of the food and agribusiness sector. We do this by providing leadership across sharing knowledge, building capability, and creating connections to over 180,000 businesses that work across our ecosystem to grow the share of Australian food in the global marketplace. Through our consultation with industry, we've identified strategic areas of market failure, and we've worked in a consultative way with various stakeholders, particularly industry, to develop the strategic responses and all that's required to address food waste. And all our activities in the areas of food waste and understanding the supply chain is just one example of what we have done in terms of helping our sector grow. FIAL has a long history of leadership in reducing food waste. Since 2017, FIAL has been supporting the Australian government in implementing the National Food Waste Strategy. We have worked with cross-sectorial and cross-supply chain steering committees, states and territories to develop resources for implementing the strategy, including a roadmap. The roadmap highlighted the need for a feasibility study to investigate whether it is possible, as well as affordable, to meet the strategy's target of reducing Australia's food waste by half by 2030. In 2020, FIAL released a foundational report called Project 2030, Capturing the Prize for the Australian Food and Agribusiness Sector, where the work shows that how we can double the output of the sector. And there are 19 opportunities that underpin this growth. And one of those opportunities is reducing food loss and waste. And that's really exciting to hear. FIAL has continued to invest in food waste, which is an area of public policy for our industry. And by funding this feasibility study is just one other piece of work that we are doing to help realise this value of reducing food waste by half by 2030. This feasibility study has a number of significant importance. Not only were we interested in investigating the tonnage of food waste across the supply chain, because that's important, you've got to know your baseline so you know what you're targeting to reduce. We also wanted to understand all the inputs as well as the outputs, and particularly the environmental impact associated with wasting the 7.6 million tonnes of food across the value chain. For example, we know that the land required to grow the food that is wasted is larger than the state of Victoria. Wow, what a waste, if you can excuse the pun. Australia has 9 years to meet our sustainable development, to meet the sustainable development goal 12.3 of reducing the food waste by half. So we need to get on, we need to act quickly, we need to be targeted, and we need to know where to focus. There is no time to waste. An important aspect for developing targeted responses is to understand where the hotspots are across the food supply chain and for which commodities. We now know from this study that fresh produce, dairy products, and red meat are hotspots, and hospitality and food service providers can do more in providing there is a clear opportunity for them to improve their practices and actually contribute to reducing food waste. The study also matches appropriate interventions to the hotspots, and the study found that industry-led initiatives provide the most cost-effective approach to reducing food waste once a supportive policy framework is in place as well. While the overall cost of reducing food waste will be substantial for industry and governments, so is the return. For every dollar that we invest in reducing food waste, we will get $7 back in return. The overall key finding is yes, 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 we can meet our target of reducing the food waste by half by 2030, but everyone has a role to play, which is why I'm so delighted that everyone is here today to launch this important study. So on behalf of FIAL, I'd like to personally extend my sincere gratitude to Carolyn for her leadership in delivering the resources that are providing the platform for reducing Australia's food waste by half by 2030. You should be proud of this achievement, and I really thank you so much. To the consortium of consultants, both here in Australia and from the UK, that have done a fabulous job of researching, analysing and modelling the data so that we better understand the feasibility of reducing food waste in Australia. Edge Environment has been the lead consultant with Life Cycles Australia. International best practice was provided by RAP and 3Kill from the UK. I would also like to thank our project advisory group of food waste experts who provided peer review at critical points as the study progressed. To the FIAL project management team, of which Carolyn leads, a special appreciation and thank you to Mark Barthel and Sam Oakton. But also I'd like to thank Steve Lapidge for giving them permission, or perhaps shall I say, giving them time to breathe and to actually spend time on this study, as this ensured that the study delivered to industry and government expectations. And to Luke and to Peter on my team, thank you for allowing this virtual event to take place. I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentations, and thank you.
Thanks, Mirjana. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome the Honourable Trevor Evans MP, the Assistant Minister for Waste Reduction and Environmental Management, to provide a formal launch for the feasibility study. Thank you, Minister.
Well, thank you very much, Carol, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to join you here electronically today, wherever you are, to launch FIAL's National Food Waste Strategy Feasibility Study. And I just wanted to add an extra and a special thanks to Mirjana and all of the team there at FIAL for producing this study and for organising today's event. I wanted to add my thanks, of course, to the consortium partners that Mirjana mentioned, including I've got here Edge Environment, Life Cycles, RAP and 3Kill, and the reps from those various organisations on the project advisory group. So that's great people from CSIRO, Oz Harvest, the Australian Food Cold Chain Council, Fight Food Waste Limited, and state, territory and Commonwealth government agencies. So thank you all, everyone, for all of the hard work that's gone into producing this document in today's event. I guess I'd start by noting that the Australian government has now had a long collaboration with FIAL. I think it is almost 10 years now, and Mirjana gave a great outline of many of the recent bits of work that we've collaborated on, the strategy, the roadmap, and so on. And I think it's fair to say that the rate of change and the pace of reform and the energy and the momentum is growing, and it continues to grow. And that's what's really exciting about today. There's certainly even been a lot more happen and a lot more announced since the roadmap was published just last year. I also wanted to note, by way of background, that the Australian government and other governments of Australia have really set this goal and reaffirmed it on so many occasions around halving food waste by 2030. In fact, we embedded it as one of the headline targets in the National Waste policy, which gathered the unanimous agreement of every state, territory and Commonwealth government in Australia, as well as in that meeting having representatives of local government and other bodies as well. Of course, we've reaffirmed it in the strategy and in the resources for implementing the National Food Waste Strategy, documents produced, of course, by FIAL. And we also have implemented it and reaffirmed it in the action plan that sits under the National Waste Policy. And for those of you who don't know, it's the action plan that really sets out not just that we have high aspirations, as all of the governments of Australia, but it specifically says who's doing what, who's leading, who's supporting, how the governments of Australia are working together, how we're monitoring and measuring our progress over time, and very importantly, of course, for governments, in many instances, who's paying for what. So in addition to that, we have thus far, of course, established Stop Food Waste Australia to deliver the National Food Waste Strategy that's led by Fight Food Waste Limited. Hello to all of the familiar faces from there on the line here today. And that's backed, of course, by many players in growing, representing the entire food supply chain and all the levels of government and, of course, FIAL. We've invested $4 million so far for Stop Food Waste Australia to implement the Australian Food Pact. So that's a voluntary agreement for industry, which brings together organisations from all parts of the supply chain to identify solutions. And they're also developing sector action plans identified in the roadmap and other important initiatives to reduce and fight food waste right up and down the supply chains. We are, of course, working very collaboratively with many of the great food charities and rescue organisations. Food Bank, Second Bite, Oz Harvest have all received additional funding in recent years from the federal government to maximise the vital food relief services that they provide, including to vulnerable Australians. And we're supporting education campaigns. And I should note in passing, of course, the recent great work of all the governments of Australia to start to harmonise the curbside and the bin solutions out there, which will assist all of us in the educational and awareness tasks that lie ahead of us. But I also wanted to specifically call out the funding that we gave to Oz Harvest, for instance, recently to design and roll out a national targeted food waste education campaign through their established Fight Food Waste program. And in terms of research and technological improvements, we've invested and continue to invest more in agricultural efficiency and innovation, waste treatment infrastructure, and ways to create value from food waste. And of course, all of these things I'm mentioning are many important parts of the puzzle that lies ahead of us as we all work towards that headline target of reducing food waste by 50% by 2030. So against the backdrop of all of those moving parts, we now, as of today, have FIAL's food waste feasibility study to consider and to work through. And I wanted to note that the federal government really values and recognises the importance of this work. It's important because it sets out how FIAL and Stop Food Waste Australia, amongst others, can prioritise all of our actions and investments from now until that deadline of 2030. And of course, it does do the important task of setting out suggested actions for government. And by that, I mean all governments of Australia, including the Australian government. The feasibility study, it does many things, but importantly, it recommends a pathway forward under which we can all work together to play our part to reduce food waste by 52%, specifically in the feasibility study, if we act on all the recommended initiatives. So how do we do it? Well, FIAL recommends that we continue to build on the BAU activities that we already have underway, including some of those that I ran through quickly before, and combine that with new and existing initiatives, sometimes led by or sometimes supported or empowered by governments, and often requiring the full buy-in and the voluntary engagement of important industry players. The study recommends a focus on food waste hotspots that Mirjana mentioned some of those across and up and down the supply chains, and also importantly, the household and the hospitality sectors. And FIAL's work here today, it provides us with a delivery trajectory, I think. It has interim targets, it's got milestones. All of these things are incredibly important for turning what is a quite significant and ambitious headline target into bite-sized pieces that we can all continue to work on as the weeks turn into months, turn into years over the remaining 9 or so years that we have to work with. There's a couple of recommended interventions that I wanted to specifically call out and note. Obviously, companies participating in the voluntary Australian Food Pact, a national behaviour change campaign, both for households and for the hospitality and the food service sector, a code to be developed for the cold food handling parts of the chain, and best practice on use by or date labelling on food, and many, many more. Stop Food Waste Australia and its industry partners, I think, have an important role to play here to help deliver in a number of these areas. But there are also, and I have to recognise this very much so, there are quite ambitious actions suggested for governments, including the Australian government, grants for food loss and waste prevention and research, and investments in national infrastructure, some of which I think will be occurring soon following the announcement that we made in the budget recently for the Food Waste for Healthy Soils Fund, for instance. The study also importantly calls on householders to do the right thing, and that is one of the big challenges that we all face going forwards. The document suggests that they'll need to reduce their overall food waste by a minimum of 30% over the time that's remaining. And based on FIAL's updated figures, I understand that means that instead of wasting an average of 312 kilos per person per year, Aussies are going to have to do the hard work needed to reduce that down to underneath 220 kilos per year. And I also just wanted to call out and note the FIAL recommendation for changing the definition of food waste to exclude inedible food. So there's a lot there to think about, I guess, is the conclusion that I would draw, and there's a lot there for all of us to work on. And I do believe that it is quite a sound basis for our future actions and for our future engagement and collaboration. I know that in the first instance, Stop Food Waste Australia will use this to inform their methodology to identify and select new sector action plans and deliver sector-specific projects that help us along this journey. And I guess in conclusion, increasing our food waste and reducing the food that we call waste is not going to just be achieved by FIAL. It's not just going to be achieved by government. It's not going to be achieved by any single actor working alone. We really do need to maintain the steady and growing collaboration and engagement that there is between all of the players that I just mentioned and all of the players up and down the food supply chain sectors and industries. We're all going to continue to have to engage very, very heavily. And so as I say a big thank you again to FIAL for all of the work that you've done in generating this important document. And as we launch it, I also did just want to pay tribute to so many other familiar faces that there are on the line here today, and to thank you from the bottom of my heart for engaging and collaborating so constructively with me personally, but also with the Australian government and other governments around Australia in recent times. As I said at the outset, the rate of change, the pace of reform has really been growing steadily in recent years, and I predict that the rate of progress will continue. And that's going to require us all to continue to work so constructively and engage heavily with each other going forwards. I love this style of engagement. Thank you to everyone who's been a part of it so far. Thank you again to FIAL. Back over to you, Carolyn.
Good. Thank you so much, Minister, for coming and giving us your synthesis of the report. It's interesting to hear it from your perspective, and I'm sure that the other folks across the call today will recognize your contribution. Thank you too. So now let's learn a little bit more about the study, and we're going to we've asked Max Van Been from Edge, our head consultant, to help us with that. And so Max has been working with the FIAL team and the FIAL project team for 15 months. We have each other on speed dial, basically. Max is I'll give you a bit of a short bio for each one of the speakers that we're going to talk to today. Max he's head of sustainability strategy at Edge Environment. He has over 12 years of strategic consulting experience across the corporate and government sectors. He specializes in organizational sustainability strategy, ESG advisory and the delivery of complex multi-stakeholder sector-wide transformation projects. You could almost say for that latter one, insert feasibility study here. Max, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Mirjana, and the Minister as well. I'm going to quickly share my screen, so bear with me one moment. If you could please confirm, one moment, that is sharing now.
Yep.
Great.
It's done.
Fantastic.
Perfect.
Thank you. Well, look, I'm very pleased to present you with the results of the food waste strategy today. I have been the project manager of this project for the last sort of 15 months and led the consortium of Edge Environment, WRAP and Life Cycles and 3Kill. A lot of the headlines of this study have just been mentioned. And so hopefully what I'm going to try and do here over the next 20 minutes is give you a very high-level rundown of some of the key headline stats and data that we think might be helpful in engaging in this work when you go out into industry. The first thing I should say is that there is no shortage of information for you to access here. We've got on this link at the bottom of this page, I think all the people on the call should have access to that link. We'll provide you access to the report itself and if you felt like diving into the 200+ page appendix that has all of the assumptions that sit behind this, more than welcome to. We've got our graphical executive summary, but most importantly, I think we have the data dashboard. Now, the data dashboard is a Power BI based dashboard that breaks down the key data that sits behind this study. And that's important because it allows you to break down, for example, the national food waste baseline by commodity group or where in the value chain it is, so specifically for your requirements with where you are in the industry. It's a really powerful tool, and I hope that you'll use it because we want people to engage with the data that sits behind here to inform their own policies and programs. Look, our brief, it was almost the perfect brief for a strategist like me. The brief is, can we halve food waste? And if so, how? Obviously leveraging off the National Food Waste Strategy in 2017, which the Minister and Mirjana just talked about. That outlined the definition of food waste and committed to halving food waste by 2030. And we are tasked with working out, is that actually feasible? So the objectives of the project were to update the national food waste baseline, and that included an articulation of where the hotspots were in that baseline. We also needed to test different scenarios to try and work out, well, one, was it even possible to halve food waste? And two, what are the best macro levers to pull on in order to do that? We had to design a recommended scenario and then ultimately develop a clear sort of business benefit. So broadly speaking, our methodology followed that. We did, of course, a best practice review, baseline update, scenario analysis, and recommended scenario finally with a business case. And so I'm going to talk you through, I think, some of those as we go through today, some of the key insights. Don't just want to talk on conclusions. I'd like to talk you all the way through because there are key insights that we established throughout the whole journey. The first thing to say, and this is a very important point, is around the scope of the project, particularly around the Australian definition or the definition as outlined in the National Food Waste Strategy of food waste. And I'll let you explore that yourself, but importantly, the definition includes both edible and inedible food. So that means that it also includes the seeds and the bones and all the other stuff that we throw out that's included in the target. Also, the target only applies to food waste prevention or avoidance. So that means that interventions considered in the study were only those that really prevented or avoided food waste. It didn't include things like reuse didn't include recovery. It did include things like reuse, diversion, for example, to donation or animal feed, but didn't include things like recycling or recovery. So that's an important thing to mention. And those interventions obviously play a very important role in mitigating the impact of food waste, but do not count to the target and therefore were not considered in the scope of this study. So I just want to mention that now because it's quite important. Step one, of course, for us was to make sure that we leveraged off the great work done by other nations and also looking at other strategies that have been put in place. And we did that through a series of interviews and desktop review. Ultimately, we came up with a list of 47 different food waste interventions. across these 7 different categories. And that was essentially the shopping list that we got to choose from when designing up the scenarios. I'm not going to go into those too much detail now. So then after we did that, of course, we had to update the national food waste baseline, which anyone who's been involved in the food waste space knows not a small task. Luckily, we weren't starting from scratch. We had seen there was an initial baseline done in 2019. When that was done, a range of gaps were identified, data gaps. So we leveraged some of those data sets. We supplemented that with a range of other data sets from a variety of different primary sources. We also went out to industry from a stakeholder engagement point of view and get a lot of primary data sets. In fact, we had over 170 different data sets to inform this baseline. Importantly, we used, I suppose, a mass balance approach in this one, which essentially balanced out the inputs, the stuff that's going into the food system, and then the stuff that's coming out to try and identify where food loss was across the value chain. And that provided us a little bit more granularity to work with. And then, of course, we did the hotspotting process in line with, I suppose, the requirements of the hotspot methodology outlined by the UNEP. Which explored the whole life cycle impact of wasted food. It's important to note the time frame where this baseline sets. It's 1890 because that was when that original data set was gathered, and that sort of has a bit of an implication on forecasted baselines as well, which I'll note later. So when you look at that baseline, 7.6 million tonnes of food waste annually is wasted by Australians. That's, as was mentioned before, around 312 kilos per person. That's about 7.6 is about a 0.3 million tonne increase from the last baseline. But importantly, when we look at the data, and if you decide to dive into the baseline on the data dashboard, you'll see a few interesting things. As you might expect, a large majority of that waste occurs in the consumption end, particularly you can see there in households. And the data did find that, a lot of the key stats that get thrown around in the food waste space, one of them is that 1 in 5 bags of groceries gets thrown out. And our study broadly supported that, particularly in the household space. So that's significant. And looking across the whole value chain, about 50% of the waste goes to landfill. And obviously that greatest percentage is there in that household consumption hospitality space. Importantly, about 70% of the waste that gets thrown out is edible. So that's important to consider when we're thinking about that definition of food waste and how that might impact the trajectory that we take or the feasibility of reaching that target. As was mentioned before, we did break down that baseline and the hotspotting process into 18 core commodity groups. And I'm not going to dive into this because there are many charts that sit behind this, and we could go into this for a long, long time. Other than to say that if you are in an industry that's particularly interested in a commodity group, we'd very much recommend you to have a look at the dashboard and also the report. There's more information in the report, particularly on these hotspots, and see where your particular commodity group might be having an impact. One thing that we can clearly see is the cumulative impact of food waste as it continues down the value chain. And that really applies to all of the hotspot criteria. And that's because as it continues down, of course, we add more value to it as we process it and we embed more energy into it. And so we're seeing that a lot of those hotspots are occurring towards the end of cascading down towards the end of that value chain. Moving on to the hotspots more on a macro level. So, the 4 key hotspots of cost, carbon, water, and land use. Now, from a cost point of view, we found that really this equates to approximately $36 billion worth of cost to the economy, food waste on an annual basis. That is a lot of money. And that is actually bigger than the $20 billion previous number that's been quoted, or roughly. And that's really because what we have considered is along the full supply chain here. And again, it's that accumulation of value as you go up the supply chain. It's very important that we consider that. Of that $36 billion, $19.3 billion is the cost that households are really occurring in their food waste, which equates to around $2,000 to $2,500 per year per household. That is not a small annual budget in terms of households. And we're looking at 17.5 million tonnes of carbon across that in a year. Now that's 3.5% of Australia's annual emissions. It's important to put this in context. A lot of other OECD countries have a number maybe closer to 8% of their annual emissions, and we obviously do have a high level of food waste. But it's also important to consider that our overall national carbon footprint is about 2.5 times higher than many other, particularly European countries, and that of course will reduce the percentage that the food waste percentage, the emissions of our percentage of our overall emissions is. 17.5 million tonnes of carbon is not a small amount. 286 litres of water per person per day. That is also not a small amount of water. That includes all the sort of blue water footprinting, so all the irrigation that goes into the growing of the food, the processing of the food, full life cycle impacts. And of course, as we mentioned before, 25 million hectares of wasted land, which is roughly the size of the state of Victoria. So that is a lot of land that goes into growing and producing food that ultimately gets wasted. So after we developed the hotspots, we looked at the hotspots and the baseline, we had to go in to do our high level scenario analysis. And the reason for this is we had to ask the question, is it even technically possible to halve food waste? One thing is it realistically feasible, which is what our scope was, but first we need to answer, actually, is it physically possible if we throw everything at it? We also need to work out what are the macro levers that we need to pull in order to maximize food waste reduction, but importantly, what are those levers? What's the most cost-effective approach to that? So we had 4 different scenarios. One was current progress maintained, which is broadly speaking, the continual progress of all the policies that are currently put in place and the trajectory that we're currently on. A policy-led approach, an industry-led approach, and an approach where we threw everything at this issue, cost being no barrier. And as I said, we had this list of 47 interventions. And again, I'm not going to go into this, and I encourage you to look at the report to see what those 47 were. We had a kind of a curation of 47 different interventions which we modeled. And obviously we curated those depending on which scenario we were doing and also the impact or the abatement impact of each of those scenarios. We had quite an incredible abatement model that we explored. And the results of the scenario analysis, well, the first thing you'll note is that we needed to amend the baseline. So the baseline for 2020, and that was in line with population growth, was 7.9 million. And then obviously as we grow population based on the projected population growth, 9.2 million out to 2030. And what we found is that if we maintain the current progress, we'll see about a 23% reduction in our food waste. So we'll get about halfway there. So it's really not enough. Conversely, if we did everything, if we threw the kitchen sink at this issue, every single possible resource, taking it from other places, we could definitely do it. In fact, we can do it significantly early, but it will cost us, in excess of $10 to $11 billion, which really doesn't provide a really great return on investment in that context. Importantly, no one single individual lever will be sufficient in order to get us there. We did see, however, the industry-led approach was the most effective, but only in a supportive policy environment. Importantly as well, from a cost point of view, all of the different interventions were cash positive. And then of course, we developed the recommended scenario, and that was a curation of 23 of what we saw as being the most impactful interventions, and those interventions, importantly, that addressed the hotspots. So that's important that what was important this time around is that we made that scenario ready for the real world. So we stress tested in terms of how the interventions work together, how we account for abatement in that instance, and more importantly, when they start. So here's the list of our 23 interventions, and I'll let you explore them in the strategy document itself. I'm not going to be able to go into details now, but some were already mentioned. So of course we have the national campaigns at the top there. They're going to be important in driving behavior change. We have the policy-led interventions, particularly tax credits and infrastructure spending. In the industry-led interventions, the big headline items here were the voluntary agreement, increased aversion to food donation, shelf life, date labeling. It's only when all of these things were considered did we then consider food waste to animal feed, which was important, but also seen as sort of potentially lower on that food waste hierarchy. It's important to note as well the time frame that we have outlined for a lot of these things, and I suppose that goes to demonstrate the urgency of the trajectory that's required, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the other thing to say is that these interventions weren't modeled on an individual basis. We modeled this as a scenario, and that goes to say that you can't consider these as standalone interventions. There is significant independencies in how these interventions operate. Obviously, for example, operational efficiencies in industry are going to be somewhat reliant on, for example, government grants or supporting lean manufacturing. So it's important to know the effectiveness of this scenario and our ability to reach this trajectory, and the findings of this report require all of these things to be implemented together. And what we found, of course, is that it is possible to achieve the target by 2030 under the recommended scenario. In fact, as the Minister said, we can make it reduced by 52%. Now, we aren't well ahead of the target here. In fact, we're just scraping over the line sometime around 2029, but we do make it. And that delivers around 22 million tonnes of food waste avoidance and about 50 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent avoided emissions. Now that's equivalent of roughly taking half, if you consider that Australia's annual transport emissions is around 100 million tonnes, takes half of our transport off the road for a year. It's a significant amount of emissions reductions. Importantly, I think we should recognise what will the food waste profile look like in 2030 and where have we gotten the reductions. And you'll see that by 2030, in order to meet this scenario, we're going to have to pretty much eliminate food waste in wholesale retail. This is an opportunity where it makes sense to reduce food waste. We're going to need to see about a 60% reduction across all other elements in the value chain, of course, apart from households. Now, household behaviour change and food waste reduction is stubborn. We know that from anyone who works in this space will know that it is a stubborn space to get meaningful change in. We won't achieve this target unless we get a minimum of 30% reduction in household food waste. So it's an important thing to contextualise. It's also important to think about what happens if we exclude inedible food waste from the target. And just a point to note that will get us there slightly quicker. It gets us around to that 56% reduction and we'll be there, about a year or a year and a half before earlier than if we included both the inedible and edible. Again, that information is in the report. So then we dive into the cost benefit analysis. If you do all this, that sounds great. How much is it going to cost us, and what benefits are we likely to receive here? And we did do a CBA looking at what's the costs of the capital infrastructure to implement those 23 interventions and the OPEX required in order to manage and operate those interventions. We also looked at the cost savings primarily through the value of food waste avoided. We know that the value of food is high. And so if you can not waste it and actually get it purchased by consumers, or you can eat it, it is dollars saved, as we mentioned before, and also, of course, avoided landfill costs and social costs of carbon. Again, the CBA was done at the scenario level, not at the individual level. So this needs to be considered all as one. So what do we find? Well, the total cost required is going to be around 7 to 7.5 billion. And we do have a range there, which kind of outlines the margin of error for the CBA. But importantly, about 4.6 billion of that has already been committed or planned. And that's through some of the initiatives that the Minister just outlined and commitments that have been made out over the next 10 years in relation to food waste and the food waste challenge. That does, however, leave around $2 billion of new spending that is going to have to be found. And about 3/4 of that, we think, as a recommendation, this strategy will likely or should come from industry, primarily because industry will be the ones that bear the greatest benefit. So while those numbers might sound large, ultimately a lot of spending's already been done and momentum's already there. There is some additional spend requirement, but those people who pay are going to be those people who benefit. And this is how they benefit. Ultimately, we've just suggested a $2 billion new spend, or a total spend of about $7 billion, but that will deliver around $58 billion of net benefit back to society. And that's the majority of that is avoided food waste, but also we're seeing indirect benefits or landfill costs and social costs of carbon. And the chart here demonstrates who's going to get that money back, where are the savings going to be realized. But ultimately, that means that for every $1 spent by society, society gets back around 7. So that's a great return on investment. But if you look specifically at who benefits and who pays, industry will, if industry spends around if every dollar industry spends, they'll get around 21 back. So it is a real powerful ROI for industry, primarily because they're the ones, apart from households, that are really benefiting from the direct savings of avoided food waste. The other thing to consider is that the abatement cost. So we've got an abatement cost broadly of $140 per tonne of CO2. Now, if we compare that to other carbon abatement opportunities, that seems relatively high. But one thing that doesn't consider, that's purely from a numbers point of view in terms of the scope of this CBA, it does not reflect the broader societal and environmental benefits of food waste reduction. So I think it's really important that beyond just the dollar value return, we consider that. And that's really for government, that's of course meeting their requirements in terms of the SDGs, meeting their requirements in terms of the Paris Agreement. It's also got a massive impact on freeing up edible food for individuals, for vulnerable communities. We saw in the most recent hunger report that 1 in 5 people are experiencing some form of food insecurity in Australia. Now, from all reports from our food donation partners, that's skyrocketed as a result of COVID. And these interventions will direct more food away from our landfill and into the mouths of people that need it. And importantly, there's an element here around efficiency of land use. If we can make our land more efficient and produce more product and ultimately get more product to consumers, that also increases our exports. The less we waste, the more we produce, the more we can export, better for the government. Industry, of course, as well, many benefits beyond a simple ROI, increased collaboration along supply chains that delivers more benefits, not just in terms of food waste, but in terms of broader emissions reductions from a corporate perspective, packaging. I think we can see where that goes. The development of new markets and new products. We've already seen development of second bite products, but there are going to be many more available valorization opportunities for industry. And I think more importantly, efficiency opportunities, less food waste, more efficient use of refrigeration and logistics. Everything gets more efficient and leaner. So there are many benefits for us to consider beyond just the dollar value ROI or cost savings of doing this. As the Minister mentioned, we've outlined a pretty detailed roadmap of what some of these key milestones might be. We can see that we've got targets pretty clearly set. And again, the food waste baseline is adjusted according to population. So I'll let you guys read that at your own time. But I think that the thing that I'd like to finish on is just a few conclusions in this. As you know, it is feasible to halve Australia's food waste, but it will require unprecedented action. We have seen by other countries, particularly the UK, they're already halfway towards achieving their target. So it is potentially possible. It's not just a pipe dream, but it's not going to be easy. In fact, we are going to have to implement the full recommended scenario in order to make it. And that means at the scale and importantly pace that we've described in the recommended scenario. And that is like now in order to do that. And I think we've outlined those boundaries very clearly in this strategy. Of course, federal government has a role to play. As mentioned before, they need to set the tone in the context of action through policies that support and incentivize industry. That's grants, tax credits, R&D. State and local governments will be crucial for localized activation. So that's supporting the nationwide behavior change campaigns, data collection, management, supporting of those sector-led action plans. Industry must also take the charge and really lead the charge. And that means really getting involved in those voluntary agreements, maximising diversion of waste donation, and playing an active role in the sector, in sector action plans. So I think I'm going to leave it there, but ultimately what I'd like to say is that as a strategist, I work on climate and environmental challenges that we face a lot. My job is to explore the business case for taking action. And really, when it comes to the plethora of actions that society needs to take in terms of addressing our social and environmental challenges, this one has to be on top of the list. It ticks so many boxes, and it is truly a win-win-win situation. So I hope that that's been outlined in this report. And again, I wanted to acknowledge and thank FIAL for the opportunity to work on this project, and also thank my consortium partners who helped deliver this. So I'll pass it back over to you, Carolyn.
Thanks, Max. That was a very kind of energetic portrayal of a very complicated and complex study that we've been involved in for the last year. So we've got 3 panelists now, which is a great opportunity to hear from different perspectives on the results that they've heard. They've also had copies of the report in advance, so they've had a bit of a read. And I'd ask now, please, we'll start with Dr. Steve Lapidge. Steve's the CEO of the Fight Food Waste Limited, which incorporates Fight Food Waste Cooperative Research Centre and Stop Food Waste Australia. So, Steve, what are your reflections when you're hearing Max's results?
Thanks, Carolyn, for the opportunity. First of all, I just want to let people know the difference between our 2 divisions. So, Fight Food Waste Cooperative Research Centre is an research development and extension arm funded by the Federal Department of Industry, and Stop Food Waste Australia is a new entity or new division which the Minister referred to as well, which is funded by the Federal Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. So together they'll work hand in hand to try and achieve this target. Secondly, I do want to really congratulate FIAL on this piece of work. It's gone above and beyond what was required under the national, or the initial funding under the National Food Waste Strategy. And I don't know of too many countries that have really taken this approach where they've taken a long, hard look at whether they can achieve this target or not. And I think that's, it's something unique and something that needs to be celebrated and recognised by all stakeholders in this field. Sorry, now getting to your question, Carolyn. What's it mean for us? Well, look, we will be using this as our guidebook, going forward. It will guide our future R&D portfolio within the CRC. It'll help decide who are the best industry signatories for the Australian Food Pact, who can deliver the best bang for their buck. And it will certainly also help guide us, and already is, in deciding what our sector action plans will be under the Stop Food Waste Australia banner as well. So, I will be referring to this constantly. I think it's a magnificent piece of work, and it will be so, incredibly powerful for us as a country. And I'm sure, other countries will be looking to, emulate this piece of work very shortly as well. So well done, Max, and all involved in this project.
Thanks, Steve. We'll be coming back to the panel members in a second with some questions that go across, but this is just the kind of first reflections. Amanda Kane joins us as well. So Amanda is the manager of organics at New South Wales EPA. She manages the New South Wales government's $105 million program to get food waste out of landfill, including action to reduce it, increase recycling, boost donation, and develop markets for the end product. What are your initial reflections, Amanda, please?
Well, similar to Stephen, I think that it really is going to help us prioritise our actions in the future. We recently, in New South Wales, a new waste and sustainable materials strategy. It's got new requirements. It's around delivering on the net zero emissions from landfill goal. And in that is clearly a need to avoid and reduce. And one of the targets is for larger food waste generating businesses to source separate by 2025. There are opportunities and they are clearly identified through this research into where we can prioritise our action, how we can target around the hotspots, but also how we can best provide support to those sectors and deliver not only on the source separation, but also in the avoidance work as well too. And we've made assumptions that through source separation, which is one of the interventions identified, that we can effectively halve those food waste in business, working with them to do that. So that's really significant. In terms of the household, we've been working with Love Food Hate Waste for a long time in terms, and it is hard. It's really difficult to engage, and there are a lot of factors. I think these findings, which put the cost burden of food waste to more than half onto the households, the 52%, is really significant. And agree, it's a not sort of flagship for us to say to do more. We need to do more. We need to be able to support households to reduce that cost burden on them. There's so much we can do in terms of the education component, but we can also work collaboratively with the retailers, with higher up the supply chain through labelling. Sorry. In a West Flight Path, there's only three flights a week at the moment, and this is one of them. But yeah, working with everybody now as well too. So when the consumer is in the shop, that they've got a label that says this is how you keep me fresh in the fridge. That the portion sizes are reflective of what that consumer needs. So I think this is really an opportunity for us to say. And again, it's a hotspot. These are the areas where you need to target, and I think the households, this data is really it's a wake-up call to say, let's ramp that up and do more and work together to deliver on it.
Thanks, Amanda.
Right,
That's great.
now I can go mute.
Yeah. After the plane goes. Mischa Hutchinson is our last panel member. Mischa is the Food Waste Program Manager at Woolies. Mischa's has been there for the last 18 months, working closely with the Fight Food Waste CRC on reducing food waste within Woolies stores and identifying some of those opportunities upstream. So what are your initial reflections, please, Mischa?
Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks, everybody. First, I also want to congratulate the FIAL team for sponsoring and producing this study. It's a colossal piece of work, and I'm really grateful to have this resource. The most exciting part of it is, of course, it is feasible and is possible. So that's the news we wanted. But what we learned was that we're going to have to make some big investments and dedicate some people and time to achieve that target. It's critical that we have the information in the study, and we intend on using it for our strategic decision making, as well as guiding specific initiatives, specifically when it comes to the customer piece and which categories of food we need to start on to get the biggest bang for buck in the short term. On the national scale, our contributions to food waste are relatively small, but our ROI is going to be all around efficiencies, and it's going to be about increased throughput and sales. But there's also loads of non-financial benefits, which any commercial organisation can gain around customer reputation, loyalty, and also big bang for buck in the environmental space, which is a big motivator for us. There are also quite a few myths out there around how much surplus waste there is in the value chain. So having those updated numbers around primary production is going to help us have really meaningful conversations with the industry. The retail numbers, just like Amanda said, are quite, the customer numbers are quite shocking. So this is a good moment for us as a retailer to stop and think how we talk to our customers about household waste. Thanks, Carolyn.
Thanks, Mischa. Steve, are there any of the headline figures that really caught your attention? Did you just kind of go, when you read it, or even today when Max was presenting, go, oh, wow, or oh, gee? Did you have an oh, gee moment?
Yeah, a couple in both directions in one sense. So I'm glad it only went from 7.3 to 7.6. Heaven help us if it went to 15 or something like that. So, that was the good news. The figures that certainly shouldn't be overlooked is that almost doubling in economic cost around food waste. We did some estimates 6 years ago now around the $20 billion figure. And that was really a back of the envelope kind of approach at the time. And we knew it was conservative, but 36.6, I believe it is, that shouldn't be overlooked. And it certainly changes the business case around, action on food waste. I think it's the first time we've got some figures around what, the size of the land that, we waste in terms of throwing that food away. And, something that equates to larger than Victoria is just a really alarming new fact that we have. The CO2 figures are certainly, I think, more representative of where we are, close to that kind of $20 million figure. Obviously, exports not included in this, but again, that changes the business case around action in this area. The last one is the $2 billion figure. It's a big figure, but I think the other way to look at this, rather than glass half empty, is glass half full, and say, well, actually, we're already investing $5 billion in this area collectively, and so the $2 billion is something that should be able to be achieved over the next 9 years. So they're my headline figures that I take away. Thanks, Carol.
Thanks. Amanda, we'll go to you. Was there anything that just kind of caught your attention and you went, oh, wow?
Yeah, the $21 return on investment for business, which is great. Like there's a very good reason for doing this. And again, like through with Your Business's Food program that we run, it's not regarded as being a big cost in business, the food waste. It's kind of hidden. I mean, we really do have a long way to go, and I think that going down into the detail of the data, I'm looking forward to that. Like, for example, in the baseline report, and I don't know, Max, whether this is the thing, that there was 100% of institutional food waste is still going to landfill. It's not, so there's a starting point from there where we've got a lot to build on. So I think that fact that there is such a high value of return on investment is really good incentive to act with business. We've got our new program includes a $30 million allocation to 27 for business collections and avoidance. We'll be there to provide support, potentially the infrastructure, potentially training, potentially auditing and systems in place, expertise and support, working with Stop Food Waste Australia through the Pact as well too. So all of these things are coming together, but there's a good reason to make that investment when you've got that return. So I think that that's something we'll really be interested in following through and highlighting when we're working with businesses about that benefit, and monitoring and capturing as well too.
It's a whole system, isn't it? You can't just do one bit. You have to understand how it fits together and have a very systemic look at how food waste is identified and managed and monitored.
Yeah, and that
Mischa.
wasn't a figure. Sorry if I could just do that, but that was another really key finding, is how we really do need to work together, and how all of it combines together to deliver on the goal.
Yeah, it's another finding. Yes, thank you. Mischa, did you have any, wow, that's an interesting number, or boy, that's an interesting identification?
A couple of numbers really jumped out at me. The water one really jumped out at me. So even though Woolworths can't necessarily claim any benefits from that piece, but we do look at every single domain. So looking at the water piece was quite interesting, and we had some good conversations internally about that one. But the $1 investment to the $7 return for us is really our entire business case to make these changes and to make the investments that we need to make. So that's the one that's definitely the highlight for me.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Max, what do you think what does this do for kind of setting up policy or program agenda more broadly? You're into sustainability development and response. What does this tell you?
Yeah, well, I think I don't think we can get complacent by the fact that we've said that it's feasible, because, it is feasible, but it is not going to be easy. And that should demonstrate the requirement of the urgency in relation to policy and the ambition that needs to be done across policy and program design. If you look into the detail of the data here, it outlines how quickly these interventions need to be implemented. And also outlines, the level of collaboration that's going to be required in order to make them happen. So I would say the two major headline items in terms of program design and in terms of, insights in policy, it's really looking at the timings and the veracity in which this needs to happen in order to make that target, and the recognition that no one individual can happen alone. And this obviously can do this alone. And this really comes down to a lot of environmental challenges that we see, but particularly around the integrated element of integrated nature of the food system. In that, Mischa's Woolly's gonna have to work very closely with her suppliers, which she obviously already does, and equally, up the value chain as well. There needs to be full supply chain engagement on this.
That's great. We've got some questions now that are starting to come through on chat. So if the panel will bear with me, I'll try and go through them. This is a really interesting one, and I won't attribute the person in case they want to tiptoe away quietly. One of the greatest barriers to food waste reduction is the perception of a business, in particular householders, of food waste actually occurring in their own home and business. We've seen that from the CRC's household study, that they thought that they were doing a good job, but they weren't. Underreporting and lack of awareness in what food waste actually is. Any comments in relation to what can be done to ensure, this kind of goes along with what Amanda was saying about measuring. What can be done to ensure everybody understands what their contribution actually is, from the panel? I might go first to Steve because I know he's very interested in a nationwide behavior change campaign to get some of this understanding shared. Would you like to respond to that question, please?
Yeah, sure. And I don't know whether I caught all of it, but I think that the key parts are how do we get that positive feedback loop around the effort we make to reduce food waste in our household. So, we continually improve ourselves. Look, our survey results so far in a number of national surveys indicate that most people, the vast majority of the population, around 70% or so, want to reduce their food waste. They see it as a valid cause, but generally they don't know how, and they're looking for those tips and tricks to reduce waste in their home. But of course, people will do that for some time, but unless they're getting that positive feedback loop around what they're achieving, then they're probably not going to do it. Now, there's many ways you can do that. You can monitor yourself using apps, and we're looking at an app that does that. But there's other things that I think we can integrate into, like retailers, loyalty programs, things like that, which track obviously your shopping habits, to see how you're performing in this area. And I think it's innovation in this area to give you that kind of positive feedback loop that will really drive people to reduce food waste in their homes.
Does any of the other panel members want to have a talk about the kind of perception versus the reality, particularly in homes and businesses?
Well, it is absolutely true that people don't think it's them. They don't, and I think that came up in the household research, but they really don't believe that they do waste food, and that's businesses and household. The principle of that measure, target and act, and it's the measuring, and again with all of the work that we've done with businesses on avoidance and reduction so far, it's actually in the measuring and seeing it, and that's always a shock. It really does surprise businesses and the householders. Our Food Smart program requires you to, and we've scaled it down. We started off with asking people to actually measure their food waste for 7 days, and it went to 3 days. Now we ask them to do a pantry and clean out their fridge just to see how much food waste there and take a photo and send it back to us, because we know that step is the thing that makes people go, well, wow. And then when they've gone through the program at the end of it, when they do the same thing and there's half as much, then they feel better about it and they carry on those behaviors. So it is definitely in seeing it. I think that measuring process, and I think what Stephen was saying about using technology and tracking is what's required. Of course, all at the same time in a busy world when you're trying to run a household or run a business whose priority is actually not food waste, it's something else, making nice food or doing whatever it is. So these are challenges. This is why it's not going to be easy, and it involves humans. They're easy when you're involving humans.
Thanks, Amanda. Max, can you please explain to one of our attendees today about the climate hotspots? When you had the slide up with the climate hotspots, talk a bit more about perhaps the hotspot identification. You don't have to go to the slide, but just talk about what a climate hotspot means so that they understand.
Yeah, great. Well, I think what we talked about in the climate hotspots is really exploring the full life cycle. You saw we had that particularly at the commodity level, and we started analysing that at the commodity level, and every commodity, whether it be grain or meat, will have a certain amount of embedded carbon in that. So we know, for example, the hotspots telling us that the dairy products and meats, by their nature, are high emissions sort of production processes through the agriculture processes that go behind it, and so that's taken into consideration, as well as things like the logistic requirements of moving this product around, and importantly, as we move product from primary all the way through to retail, more and more of our energy gets put into that product, and so the embodied climate impact, or it gets culminated or cascades down the value chain. Hopefully that answers the question, potentially. But yeah, so it's really interesting actually to have a look at the climate hotspots across various different commodities to explore how different products really contribute to essentially the emissions of our food waste.
Thanks, Max. I'm sure that will help our colleague. With regarding to some of the, you're sending through questions, you've sent through questions before. What we're going to do with the questions is we're going to compile them into FAQs and put them up on our website within a week or so. So stay tuned and look at the website in about a week. Give us some time, but we will respond back to them. We've got another really good one here that's kind of a different flavor, which was, what actions do you guys suggest for community waste or climate activist groups to pressure industry and government to drive change? So we've seen that government and industry are the important players. How can a community activist, what should they focus on? How can they work to see the type of change that we actually need? Steve, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, writing to your local minister and making sure that they're aware that this is an important topic for them. I mean, we are coming up to a federal election sometime in the not too distant future, and I think we need people to say, this matters to me, climate change matters to me. And that's certainly one way that everyone can be involved. Of course, changing your own behaviour in your house is probably the first step. And making sure that you aren't wasting food and minimising food waste. But then if you are, unavoidable waste, you're putting it to compost and things like that, whether your own or to FOGO collection. So, you're walking the walk as well. And certainly within our organisation, we're keen for everyone to walk the walk. So yeah, there are probably a couple of key areas that I would be focusing on, Carolyn.
Great. Mischa, do you have, you're involved in retail and they're all over the country. Do you have any ideas about how you can help community activist groups? What can they do to get this in focus with their local communities or their local governments?
My answer is not too dissimilar from Steve's around local government. So writing to your local representatives is a great way to enact change, and writing to organisations is actually a good way as well. So Woolworths, we read every customer correspondence, we respond to everything. So if we are seeing a trend of groups or individuals writing to us about their food waste concerns, that will definitely be heard. The other thing that I was going to suggest, perhaps cheekily so, is that we've already discussed a little bit with the household work that change only can happen with awareness. So doing the grassroots work of helping the community around you and the people around you in your immediate vicinity understand what's actually going in their bin and the actual costs, the environmental costs of food waste, that will be a really great way to spread the word amongst around the community, and then in turn that will then pressure companies like Woolworths.
Great, thanks. Steve, you've got another idea.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, I've certainly been approached quite a bit lately from urban farming groups, and who are taking food waste, recycling it on near to where it's occurring, and putting it back onto farms. I do note that a local supermarket in South Australia actually is looking to establish an urban farm where people can pick direct and things like that. I think there's some really innovative approaches going on here, and often it takes some community groups to really build up the business case around that for where we go in the future. So certainly encourage it.
So thanks, Steve. And Max, you deal with a whole bunch of people through your role as a consultant giving sustainability advice. Have you got any ideas to help kind of focus community groups on what might work for them?
Well, I mean, I think the thing about community is really that grassroots element. And I think I kind of want to acknowledge this in the study. And I did mention it before. This is focused on food waste prevention and avoidance. But, food waste recycling and the role of FOGO and compost is crucial. And getting that infrastructure in place where communities can access it. We live, the biggest challenge we have, and we're working, we've seen really great opportunities about making essentially compost available for people in multi-unit dwellings. We're all living in urbanized environments. So making that accessible to people, providing the localized infrastructure for people to take their food waste away while reducing the administrative burden of that, whether it's through community farms or through an urban compost solution, food waste pickup, really is important, and we need to find a solution in that space. We haven't addressed that in the context of the emissions reduction opportunity in this particular study, but it would be significant if we can increase that diversion of household waste to compost. So I think it's important that we acknowledge the grassroots capacity of community groups to establish those composting and food waste recycling opportunities.
Excellent. I'm going to go now. I'm just looking at the clock. We might give you all a bit of an early mark, give you 15 minutes back in your day. But I would like to ask the panel one last question. So we've looked at the numbers, we've seen the graphs. Max and his team have done a great job. So that's what that says. I'm asking you, what's your gut feeling? What do you guys as individuals in the roles that you have think that we can actually get there? What do you think? Amanda, I'll let you go first. Can we beat this target?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. But it's not going to be easy, and we're all going to have to make an effort, but it's the same as tackling climate change. But I actually think it's going to be within the context of climate change that we get the action, because over the next 9 years, reducing emissions and better managing our resources and making the most of it, and the water figure, these are things that as a society we're not going to be able to pretend aren't happening anymore. We're all going to need to act on it, and this is going to be a really significant, it's an important contributor to that work. So assuming the world gets its act together and we do actually address climate change and we keep the warming within 1.5 degrees, then we absolutely will deliver this, because this will be part of the many things that we do to actually make sure we make the most of our environment and do better. So yes, we can do it, and we've got good policy settings in place, particularly in New South Wales. We've got we've got funding, we've got this evidence base that tells us what to do. So I think there's a lot of things there to help us on the way as well.
Good. Thanks, Amanda. Mischa, what do you think? Are we going to get there?
We are going to get there. I have full faith. I think we were going to get there because there's a lot of passion behind it, and the amount of people in Australia who are aware and getting on board with this is growing every day. Plus, it makes really good sense for everybody to get involved. So businesses, everybody in the value chain stands to benefit, triple bottom line. So yes, I think we will get there.
Excellent. Steve, what about you? From a researcher's perspective, are we going to get there?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we represent more than just the researchers. I guess, so yes, I think we can, but we've got a long way to go. And there's it would be remiss of me not to mention that we've got a couple of key missing ingredients at the moment, and the Minister touched on some of these before. Things like a national behaviour change campaign, I think, is going to be critical to achieving that target. If we look at a place like the UK, yes, they've achieved 27% food waste reduction in the last 15 years, but that's just targeting edible and post-harvest. So we're not comparing, ourselves. We've got a much broader definition here, and that's going to be harder to achieve. But I think we're heading in the right direction. The momentum's there. There's a huge groundswell at the moment. So yes, I hope we can, but let's not take our foot off the pedal, and let's try and fill those missing key gaps we've got at the moment that will be required to achieve that target.
Cool, thank you, Dave. So Max, you've done the hard yakka with all the numbers and crunching, and so what do you, Max Van Been, think as compared to Max?
Oh, wow.
Think?
Putting me on the spot, asking me to conflict my own report. No, look,
No
as I
pressure.
said, yeah, I think the outlines of the report say that it is possible, but under the, I suppose, the framework that we've outlined, which means a lot of action very quickly. And I think it's also worth, and that's, how do you define what is feasible? Really, that's what the question was. What are the boundaries of feasibility? Well, we've identified a roadmap that we think is feasible, but it really does require action. And feasibility is a broad term, and what might be feasible to one person may not be feasible to another. So we know technically it's definitely possible. Technically, it can happen. And feasibly, in terms of cost threshold, in terms of engagement, it is very much feasible in most people's definition of feasibility. So I'm going to have to go with yes on that one, Carolyn.
Excellent. Well, I'd really like to, close by thanking the consortium led by Max and his team from Edge, Tim Grant and the Life Cycles team with the baseline. They were fabulous. They term themselves data geeks, and they're great. And our colleagues from the UK in terms of RAP, and Richard from 3 Keel, he's done the Power BI. When you get to looking at that, there's some very talented, devoted, very smart people that have been involved in this, and I'm so delighted that we can say, yes, we have calculated that it's feasible, and we believe that it is feasible. The links to the website will be sent to everyone afterwards. I understand there might be a bit of a hiccup with the appendices not appearing. We'll fix it. And thank everyone for attending today. The questions, we'll take these questions and collate them and make sense out of them and put some answers back within a week. Personally, this has been a really interesting journey for me, and I think I can speak on behalf of my 2 project management colleagues, Mark and Sam, that we've been challenged to ensure that we got a good outcome, and we've had lots of Monday mornings at 9 o'clock for a year and a half. So it's been a journey of love, as well as an intellectual challenge. So I appreciate the opportunity from FIAL to have been involved in this as well. So on that note, I shall say good day to this afternoon's webinar, and thank everyone for attending, and particularly thank our panelists and the Minister and Mirjana for launching it. Thanks, everyone. Bye.